Hello, Kevin Annett and my father Bill Annett with you again today, just before New Year's 2020. And we are doing another in a series on the Annett family. Today we're going to be talking about the content of a book we both wrote called The Sacrifice, A Family, an Empire, an Expendable Brother. Now this is about my uncle Bob, Dad's oldest brother, who died in the war. He died on April 29th, 1944. That's Bob right there. He was only 19. He was a sub-lieutenant on the HMCS Athabaskan. The Athabaskan was, I believe, the only Canadian destroyer sunk that way during World War II.
No, the Fraser was.
The Fraser, but it was
an older version of the destroyer was sunk, cut in half, as a matter of fact, in the Bay of Biscay by another ship.
Right. So he was one of very few Canadian destroyers that went down. What happened was Bob went in the water with 100 other guys. There's a question whether it was friendly fire from a British motor torpedo boat or from a German E-boat. That's still kind of uncertain. But what we do know is that the Admiralty office in Plymouth, England, not only told the accompanying ship, the HMCS Haida, to leave those guys in the water, they then canceled the rescue mission that was going out to rescue the Athabaskan guys, and 100 of them drowned in the water, including Uncle Bob. Now, they never gave an explanation as to why they canceled that rescue mission, knowing that these guys were going to drown in the water. And that's something that caused us to write the book, which, by the way, you can get on Amazon. It talks not only about Bob's death, but the whole way the British Empire operates in terms of covering up their crime. And we know that from my work exposing genocide in Canada and elsewhere, that's a regular imperial practice. But what do we want to talk about today is the way it affected our family. And Dad, why don't you talk a little bit about that? You know, the aftermath of how you heard Bob died and how it was.
Yeah, I was 15 at the time. Mm-hmm. And like most kids, very enthusiastic about war. And so it was a Sunday morning, I think, and I was sitting in the kitchen listening to the radio, and it was the BBC broadcasting from London. Mm-hmm. It was describing an action in the Channel where two Canadian destroyers had intercepted a couple of German Elbing-class destroyers, sunk one of them, and run the other one aground. And I was particularly delighted to hear that because Bob, at the age of 19, was gunnery officer on the Athabaskan. And then, as sort of a throwaway line, typical British fashion of much concern over colonial troops, he ended the broadcast by saying, "Oh yeah, the Canadian destroyer Athabaskan was lost. It was like a bombshell in our kitchen, and this BBC announcer was treating it like a minor statistic."
Right. Paternalistic afterthought kind of thing. What did your family do right away when you heard that?
Well, correction, I was actually in the family room, which was just adjoining the kitchen, listening to, we had a standalone radio, and I was listening to it. And Mom and Dad were both in the kitchen, and of course they both heard it and came rushing in, and we were just, I can't describe the feeling. And immediately, of course, we started sending telegrams to Ottawa and trying to get our hands on information. And for months, all we had was that he was missing in action.
Right, and after the fact, you know, around the fog of war, there's always uncertainty. People don't know all the facts and everything. But what was really telling in this case is the way the Admiralty did a quick cover-up inquiry that really buried a lot of the facts about how it went down. They never touched on the fact of why the Admiralty canceled the rescue mission. It turned out after the fact that the Commander Stubbs, the commander of his ship, had gotten hot water and been arguing with the British. And it wouldn't have been inconceivable for them to kind of say, "Oh, well, let the bastard drown," right? But whether that's perhaps speculative, but the point is, you guys didn't learn anything until after the war, right? I mean, you didn't really know he was dead till after the war.
Close to it. I mean, D-Day was only 2 months later, and we did get inklings, but we didn't know for sure that he was dead for months, at least months.
Yeah.
And we didn't, after the American army broke through to Berlin and there were war records and all that sort of thing, we actually got some of his personal effects, his watch and his wallet and so on.
Yeah.
But it was an unconscionable length of time before we knew for sure that he was dead.
Well, one thing we talk about in the book, The Sacrifice, we found there was some articles written in the Guardian newspaper that there was an operation in the British Empire right after World War II to destroy all records in the Colonial Office having to do with crimes being committed by any agent of the Crown, including during war. And so they had the orders to go through all the colonial records, remove anything that might incriminate the Crown. Whether we're talking residential schools, genocide, whether we're talking cover-ups of friendly fire in World War II, the point is all the records were swabbed. And so you can't, from the official accounts, get an accurate story of what actually went on, including with the death of Uncle Bob, right?
You didn't mention, or did you, that the Athabascan took a torpedo amidships right after they had run the second destroyer, German destroyer, aground?
Well, we talk about all that, and the only ships in the area were British motor torpedo boats, which suggests that, it was friendly fire, a British torpedo that actually went into the Athabascan. But
there was testimony by some of Athabascan's surviving crew, which were very few.
And that testimony never reached the official inquiry. It was censored right out. They didn't even call Canadian officers to serve on the Board of Inquiry. So to me it smelled like the usual kind of imperial cover-up. But be that as it may, I wanted to ask you too, your last encounter with Bob in his embarkation league. It's a really quite warm story.
Yeah, it was the summer of 1943 when he graduated from Royal Roads, which is Canada's naval academy. And he came home on embarkation leave. He had a month's embarkation leave.
Yeah.
As I say, I was 15 years old at the time, and it was such a happy occasion. He got home. I happened to be north of this little town that we grew up in. There was a lake, and it had a pavilion. And I was playing in a little jazz band, and we had a week-long job playing dance gigs at the pavilion. And so two buddies of mine and I were camping at the lake. And the thing that I'll always remember is that Bob, the next morning, instead of looking up his girlfriend or his buddies or anything like that, he borrowed the car from our dad and drove out to the lake just to see me, the kid brother that most guys would have ignored, and dumped me out of bed, ruffled my hair, and I was in the stupor from late night. And
it kind of shows the kind of guy he was, right?
Yeah, it shows what kind of a guy he was, and my impression at the age of 15, and then the fact that this marvelous guy was dead 9 months later is something I had a long time to get over.
Well, also the way he died, because we got this from a petty officer who survived and another eyewitness, that all the men were in the water. The Athabascan went down quite quickly, and when they were in the water, they saw Bob take his life jacket off and give it to a sailor who was wounded, and then tried to swim to a Carly float, but he never made it. So that kind of self-sacrificial act for a wounded man, and always as a boy, hearing that story, it kind of followed me through my life. It was an inspiration for me, in my life, and that's one of the ways that I pay homage to my uncle I never knew, knowing that the way he died for another.
Just before that, this petty officer told me, I spoke to him personally, this is years later in Winnipeg, and he said Bob was blown off his action station above the bridge into the water, and he was with Bob in the water, and first of all, this is a 19-year-old kid, and most of these sailors were, in their 20s, 30s, 40s,
Yeah.
And in the water, which was 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the hypothermia was setting in with all of them,
Yeah.
Bob led all these sailors in a sing-song to keep their spirits up. And then after that, there was a badly wounded sailor. He gave him his life raft. And this petty officer said that the two of them, he and Bob, set out for a Carly float, and he never saw Bob again.
Yeah.
Well, Bob was a strong swimmer, so it must have been the hypothermia.
Or maybe he was wounded and he
Yeah.
didn't know it,
Yeah.
or anything. But it sums up who the man was.
Yeah.
And to honor Bob. That's why we wrote this book, and urge you to get it. It's on Amazon. It's called "Let's Sacrifice" by William and Kevin Annett, and we'll have more soon. Thank you.